Welcome everyone to this seminar organized by the Middle East and North Africa program here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. My name is Ruzbe Parsin, I head the program and I will be moderating tonight's conversation, which, because it is going to be more of a conversation, will probably not need that much moderating. The headline for our conversation is Mediating in Wars from Bosnia to Gaza. And so I just want to emphasize that tonight's topic is about the art, the craft, and the science of mediation and diplomacy. And we put this headline in order to show the span in terms of the experience that our distinguished panel has. I just realized that between them, they have roughly a century's worth of diplomacy and foreign policy experience, which is impressive in and of itself. For those who are particularly interested in the keyword Gaza, I can tell you that on the 21st of May, we will have another seminar in this room with the same setup, which will concentrate fully and only on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So for those who are particularly interested in that, there will be a seminar wholly devoted to that issue. Now, in order to discuss what mediation is, what facilitation is, and what diplomacy is, we've managed to bring together, as I said, a very distinguished panel. I have Dr. Majed al-Ansari, who is both an academic, a thinker, as well as an advisor to the Prime Minister of Qatar, and the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of Qatar. Thank you very much for joining us here. We also have Ambassador Charlotta Sparre, who has been a Swedish ambassador to both Egypt and Jordan, and now heads the Swedish Dialogue Institute in Amman, Jordan. And last but in no way least, Frank Belfrage, who is the doyen of Swedish diplomats, I would dare to say, who was the cabinet secretary of Carl Bildt when he was prime minister in the 1990s, also being the ambassador to France and to the EU. So 3 persons who, through their careers, but also I would imagine through the personal experiences that they've had during those careers, have a lot to say about the interaction on the human level as well as representatives of states with other countries and other interlocutors, both in just being the representative in diplomacy, but also to mediate, whether in a formal sense or in a more informal sense. So for the conversation tonight, we are going to discuss in roughly 3 blocks. The first one is something that people tend to forget, especially when people look at institutions, which is the huge role that persons and personalities play in how those institutions fare, how successful they can be in particular situations. So I will be asking our guests a bit about how they ended up doing what they've done and what they're doing. Then we will move on to discuss the actual art of mediation. So concrete examples of how you went about doing it and what your reflections are on that. And finally, of course, the conflicts themselves, both the ones in the past who might not even have been resolved fully and the ones that are ongoing at the moment. And of course, this is not a surprise to our guests. They've been forewarned of how we're going to do this conversation. So let me start there. How did you end up doing foreign policy? Frank, you are the doyen, as I said. Would you like to start us off?
By a mistake, and actually by not reading the small text, because I needed money to make a apprenticeship in a bank in London, and I saw that the foreign ministry was actually giving these kinds of subventions. But I didn't read totally that, because there was a little footnote that you had to afterwards, you had to apply for the foreign service. So I took the money, I went to London, I was very happy and came back. And then one day the foreign ministry called and said, well, you're supposed to come for the entry examination, which I hadn't realized. And I did so, but I remained there and I stayed there and I was extremely happy for 50 years minus 3 months.
And in that sense, what was the first time you really came to understand what kind of job you had gotten yourself into?
Well, actually, already in my very first job abroad, which was at the Swedish embassy in Vienna, because I was asked to have a particular follow, particularly the dossier on the conflict between Italy and Austria regarding the South Tyrol, the Alto Adige, which was one of the main conflicts which remained after World War I. It hadn't been resolved, and actually was quite a heated conflict in the end of the 60s. And that was my first experience in following how you actually try to stabilize and try to find reconciliation in a very volatile and aggressive environment.
Who could have guessed that was still inside Europe at a time where Europe was uniting? Charlotta?
Well, for me, I think it was more a determination. I had a great curiosity. I still have a great curiosity, both for international affairs and for people and culture. I guess it was also some kind of moral aspiration for peace and development, and wanting to contribute to the role that Sweden could play in that regard.
And where did it start?
Well, it started at the foreign ministry, then I moved to Libya, and at a time in the late 80s when it was quite a challenging situation, and my background is Middle Eastern studies. I have spent most of my career working on the Middle East and lived in the region for some 20 years or so in different countries. But my first meeting, so to say, with conflict and with mediation and diplomacy related to that was in the mid-90s, when the Middle East peace process was going on, and when I was working in the ministry, both on the Middle East peace process, in the, so to say, the whole Madrid process and all the multilateral work there, but later also the work within the Barcelona process and the softer part of the, so to say, pre-conflict or confidence-building work.
And so would you say that there's a sense of déjà vu? As in, when you worked on something long enough, you see a certain pattern or repetition in the questions being asked and the answers being sought?
I think certain things do not necessarily change, and lots of other things have obviously changed tremendously, not least in terms of the geopolitical changes that we have seen. But I think also the whole craft of diplomacy has changed. When I started a long time ago under Ambassador Belfrage, it was also at a time when it was still very much state-to-state contacts, and obviously that is still a key importance of diplomacy. But I think we have all had to just adjust to a different world where there are many more actors than only states who are operating, and that is a new way of navigating diplomacy.
Very true, and there is another aspect which we will get back to, which is that the communication channels have changed as well. I mean, if we were considering how the Consulate of Europe was done in 1815, you would have diplomats and they would send some letters home. It would take them 2-3 weeks to reach the capital. While today, if I Google your name, your Twitter account comes up almost on the top. So there is a huge difference there. Majed.
Thank you. Let me just first begin by saying I'm humbled, certainly to be compared to my esteemed colleagues here, especially with the ambassador starting his career 10 years before I started breathing. So certainly I'm looking forward to learn today, and again, I'm humbled to be in their company on the stage today, and I'm humbled by the attendance and the participation, especially that a lot of the faces I see today I have seen throughout the week in various events, and to them I apologize for the huge repetition they had to deal with sitting in all of these roundtables and panels and so on. To begin, I started actually my career in the foreign ministry in a way very similar to the ambassador, but I did read the fine print and signed off willingly in a scholarship program by the Foreign Ministry. And then after I started working for 1 year in the ministry, I decided this is not for me and escaped with a very big story regarding me having to return all the money spent on me by the government. And then after about a decade of my initial escape, I was drafted back into the ministry. And that was probably the result of a renewed sense of patriotism in the whole country as a result of 2017 and the need for us to all to play a role in our national security and national interest. And that, yes, that brought me back first to head the Security Academy and then in the current role as a spokesperson.
Very good. So let's just do that as a kind of a span in terms of your experiences from very different decades. Frank, back in the time when you started, if you compare that to the speed with which things happen now, and not necessarily the voluntary transparency, but nonetheless the transparency that exists, let me ask it in a, not provocative, but still, do you think it's helpful that things are so transparent from a kind of diplomat's perspective, or do you think it was easier when you didn't have to?
There are pros and cons here, because on the one hand, yes, you're right in underlining the transparency aspect, which is very important. Public opinion is able to follow what's happening, especially since many of these issues is something which affects large, significant parts of public opinion. On the other hand, it gives you less time to reflect and to do the right thing, within quotation mark. It also gives, there's a kind of a multifaceted approach to this, because we are all traveling in the foreign services of the countries, and your minister is usually somewhere far away, and he will or she will be confronted with questions about something which has just happened. She or he will be landing on the airport and will be immediately asked a number of questions to which he or she is not prepared or hasn't been able to follow after a long haul flight. So therefore, the SMS functions to be able to send quickly. So I think by now all the colleagues have learned the way in which you can, in very fast manner, being able to brief your minister or brief colleagues about matters which are important for them from a communication point of view.
Charlotta?
Yes, no, I totally agree with the ambassador in terms of the time aspect. I think we often are in such a hurry that we don't really give ourselves enough time in terms of the reading and even the traveling. And Dr. Majed, I think it's fantastic that you have been here now for a couple of days. That is the way that we used to have visitors coming, or we went ourselves and we stayed for a couple of days, and now it is in and out. And I think that human bond that you only can create if you actually spend a little bit of time together. I think that is something that we should maybe sort of say reclaim or work on seeing how we can do. At the same time, I also think that there are a lot of advantages. We get information much faster, we can process things faster, but the big shift as I see it is the diversity. Still, when I joined the Foreign Service, there were very few women, for example, in management positions. Now we have half-half. People also come from a more diverse background. I think that is also good. It's more representative of the country in some ways that we represent. So I think that there are, like with everything else, there are things that are better, and there are things that we maybe need to reflect on. What can we, so to say, learn from the good lessons of the past?
Well, I mean, let me add on to what the colleague said regarding the speed in which we conduct our foreign policy right now. I think also there's an issue with attention spans. Right? Not only the young people, even us, have reduced attention spans now when it comes to reading, dealing with and getting the facts. I always tell our teams when they are writing for officials that any report you write now has to be WhatsAppable. And that means that if you want the official to read it, you have to be able to send it through a WhatsApp message or a text message. Otherwise, if you send documents now, probably they'll skim them over and not read. And that affects our ability to say what we need to say, but also the level of depth that our officials and ourselves would have in a lot of things. If you look at, even to our notes today, if you remember a decade ago or so, we would come into these things with big, bulky files, opening them and starting to read our talking points. Right now, something like this would be more than enough to let us speak about these issues. And, of course, that also means that with these short attention spans, we have very little time to communicate to our audiences, to our peoples, what our foreign policy is, and it is very easy to get misunderstood when you have a very short time to explain what you need. So I think it's important, as the ambassador says, to reclaim some of that longer attention span, but it's certainly not going to be possible with the current advancement in mass communication.
True, and I mean, let me, as a non-diplomat, make a little reflection and see what you think. It seems to me that, as you said, the short attention span, the speed of communication, it creates transparency, but it also forces you to try and stay ahead of a news cycle where it becomes more and more difficult to know whether the news is true or not, but you're expected to react to it either way. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, and that is perhaps a segue into our second part, which is the mediation itself, is that with this transparency and the fact that what could have been gossip in the bar where the diplomats would meet later on now becomes public knowledge, or risks becoming public knowledge while the negotiations are still ongoing, means that your ability to kind of compartmentalize the process from the public scrutiny, which in the end is probably useful, but perhaps during that sensitive phase of the actual negotiations is not necessarily helpful. And third, because from what I can read and see, diplomats negotiate, but they, depending, as you have been discussing in previous fora, they do this, depending on the mandate they have, with a look back over their shoulder to see what the capital or the political, mandate that they've been given, how far it is willing to go while you're sitting there negotiating.
So let me offer some anecdotal evidence to what you were just referring to. I was in the United States in a university giving a very similar talk to this one, and an academic turned diplomat, so that's double the ego of a normal human being. And I was speaking about the mediation in front of students, and I was asked about the recent reply, and this was a couple of months ago, recent reply to proposals, and I spoke very positively. And not knowing, of course, that with a similar camera to the one that's recording us right now, this was being broadcast on Al Jazeera to all Arab audiences, and within minutes, there was a big red, urgent message on TV saying, spokesperson for Qatari MFA says things are going very good and we are very close to a deal. And immediately the Israelis started calling and saying, you can't say this to our mediators. And the Palestinians called and said, we're withdrawing our proposal. And within probably an hour, the time it took me to open my phone again, everything collapsed. And I had to go on media and rectify what I was saying. And so that is, as you said, right now it's very sensitive to speak altogether. And because everything you say can be immediately broadcast everywhere. And as you also rightly mentioned, I think diplomats and politicians decades ago had the chance to hide what they wanted when they needed until it was right to present it. And now they don't have that luxury. We don't have that luxury. We have to deal with the facts as they are, and we have to deal with the fact that there is a chaos of information. Today, algorithms in social media allow you only to see what your pole within the polarization wants you to see. Right? And therefore, it is very easy for every side of the equation to get a completely different message, and a sea and waves of misinformation coming into them. And you have to combat that with your single, individual, non-algorithmic way of dealing with information going on in a press conference, and hoping that with your slow bureaucratic machine, you can combat the flood of information going in. So yeah, it's not easy.
Frank, is the nostalgia correct, so to speak?
To some extent, but I was going to highlight, I think, the advantages of the high speed of communication and high speed of and the way in which technology allows us today to have a multidimensional game in terms of negotiations, in terms of interaction, especially when you think of the multilateral diplomacy. You have something happening in the UN, or you have something happening in Brussels, and at the same time you have the actors active and participating in different parts of the world, when you can actually, with a somewhat of a systematic approach, you can actually gain by bringing in the other actors and checking facts, checking possibilities, sounding out prospects, and all that because of the advantages of speedy communication. I saw that especially during my days in the European Union, where you could actually interact between capitals, that was happening in Brussels, and with colleagues in the embassies in member states. You could actually bring them together, and you could actually achieve quite something.
So I'm the Luddite here who is skeptical about technology. Charlotta.
Yes, no, but I think there is so much wisdom that already has been shared, but maybe two reflections. One is on the enormous amount of information, but also how that information is used and misused, and on one hand, possibility we have to check information, on the other hand, the enormous amount of disinformation and how that is posing an enormous challenge, and just to filter that. Another aspect, I think, is, again, the possibility of diversity, of engaging more people and engaging much more broadly, which I think long-term is something that potentially can be good, especially when it comes to peace building, maybe beyond the mediation. Adding to this, however, I think is absolutely crucial to also make sure that there are spaces for the confidential conversations that are outside of the limelight. It's more and more difficult to protect, but I think it is still both possible, doable, and it's being done.
I would like to very much emphasize what Charlotta just said. I think there's no way in which you could conduct any fruitful negotiations or mediations without having actually quite some confidentiality around it. Otherwise, you can't test hypotheses, testing ideas, and finding your way. There is to. So there's a balance to be struck between transparency and confidentiality. Absolutely, I agree very much with what you just said.
But also, I mean, in a sense, what we're discussing is or at least the conception of diplomacy as this elitist thing that diplomats do for states. But now in a world with social media and so on, we also have public diplomacy and the need to kind of also go out there and tell people what's going on. So you need to do both, in a sense, to actually be able to conduct diplomacy, because you have to not just win at the negotiation table, you have to be able to sell it when you go home.
And to which you could add also that there is an element of you can actually work with media, you can actually actively leak information which will influence the course of the process, and which is a well-known technique in order to make a negotiation advance.
And if I can add to that, I think one of the main advantages of having this explosion in mass communication is the fact that now we don't have to go through any gatekeepers to communicate. You can communicate directly to the people in the field. For example, if we have any development on the mediation right now, what I simply would do is my office would draft a post for X, rather than drafting a big statement that goes through the news agency, and the news agency would distribute it to the media, which would take probably half a day. Now, within minutes, the information I post on social media would be seen as an official statement by my government, and would be seen in real time inside Gaza, inside Israel, or anywhere else, and the information would be disseminated. Of course, you bear the risk, because that means that you can't backtrack anything you say as soon as it goes out. But it certainly is beneficial in that sense. And on what the ambassador was saying, if you look at the mediation, and I'm in the job now of offering anecdotal evidence to everybody, but even in this mediation right now, it wouldn't be possible to conduct the mediation that we are doing right now between Hamas and Israel if it wasn't for the ability of the political office members in Doha to immediately talk to their counterparts in Gaza, get the responses, have the discussion, and within a day or two, do all the communication needed. You can imagine with the current situation, it would be near impossible to get messages back and forth. But because we have that, we are able to communicate with the political office in Doha. We are able to get all the information in real time.
Good. I want to really get into the mediation. Frank, what would be your two takeaways, positive and negative, in terms of what you have seen in terms of negotiations or mediation, small or big?
I think there's a moment you have to make a judgment about whether the parties are ready or not. Sometimes there is a fatigue among the parties, and that you can, of course, use for this is a propitious moment. And then there are times where either both or one of the parties feel that they can still get a better deal by increasing violence, or by holding out, or by doing other ways of obstructing the process. So it's a very much, in my view, an analysis of when is the right timing, when the parties are actually gradually ready to speak to each other, or via someone, but at least ready to engage in a process.
Charlotta.
Well, I sometimes jokingly say that my best school for mediation has been dealing with my children. I think it's a question of identifying the interests, understanding the underlying emotions, trying to see where there is an opening for de-escalation, to build some trust, to try to find a compromise. But I have also learned the very hard way that when you impose a solution, it may work temporarily and it may be de-escalating, but if you actually want to find a more long-term solution, you have to find the buy-in, and there the timing can be absolutely crucial, or one of the crucial elements. And unless there is an addressing of not only addressing of the root causes, but also an understanding from, in my children's case, 2 children, that they both understand each other, it will just continue to return. So it's only half joking, but I really do think that this has been my best school.
I can only concur. I only have one child, but one should never underestimate. I mean, if you want to be boring IR, you could say this is an asymmetric power dynamic, which means basically you think the child is at a disadvantage for being a child, but the power of saying no is something that most people and groups have, irrespective of whether they have any more power. But just being able to say no and sabotage things is more than enough. I know that from having tried to drag my son to museums. Majed.
Well, I mean, again, I do agree with the analogy itself, and I think part of that analogy also is that when you are conducting mediation, usually there is a lot of childishness in the process itself, and you have to drag the parties kicking and screaming to the museum of mediation when you need to, because it is certainly not rational thought, not even self-interest sometimes is what governs mediation, but a very superficial, emotional, heightened emotions kind of mentality that governs what happens within the mediation room. And therefore, I think when it comes to all of these mediations, two things come out that we have handled in Qatar, at least. One is that there is a great need for the mediator, building on what the ambassador said, to understand when they are doing good and when they are facilitating, prolonging the conflict through the negotiations that they are holding. At some point, you need to stop and say, listen, these sides are not serious about mediation. And unless you get serious, unless you commit to peace, there is no reason for us to continue this mediation. I think sometimes we lose that in the day-to-day and in the hopes that something would happen. I remember in one of the previous mediations we were holding, after we started mediating between the government and the separatists, or not the separatists, the opposition, the president of that country was coming to attend the ceremony, and we got a weird request from all the opposition members to go and receive him in the airport. Then we realized that that was actually a manufactured opposition. That was not the real opposition. An opposition that is willing to receive the president that they are opposing in the airport and celebrate his arrival is probably in very close term with them, and this is exactly what happened. And the mediation did not result in any peace with them because the real opposition was outside the process. The other side, which is the positive side, I think, being involved in peace facilitation as a state is an educational experience for your people. It's an educational experience, not only for the bureaucrats working in it, but for the population as a whole, to see the role of the state, to see the government doing something beyond providing services and the things that usually get your people angry about government. It is doing something that is selfless and going beyond the roles of the state and conducting mediation or peace facilitation and providing for the peoples of another country the chance for peace and prosperity. And I think it's very important for the state to capitalize on that in the educational experience within its people and in building a new sense of patriotism where the people of the country feel proud in the roles that it plays and support it from a grassroots perspective.
And I think, that is, if there's any, that has been one of the hallmarks of Swedish identity towards the world, that Sweden mediates and is, in a sense, has a larger role in the world than one would imagine just by looking at the map in terms of the population size or economy and so on. Whether that picture is still true or not, that is a different issue which we can discuss at length too, if you like. I just want to get into two things that I think all of you can address. One of them is the from below up, which I think, Charlotta, you have been working a lot on. That is mediation on a more people-to-people and human level rather than the institutional level. So that, of course, is also there when you negotiate. I remember when the JCPOA was being negotiated between Secretary of State John Kerry and the Iranian Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif, someone had counted the number of days that they met to negotiate and figured out that it was more days, the single most days American Secretary of State had spent with someone else since negotiating the end of World War I. And of course, that meant that two countries that hadn't spoken at all for 40 years suddenly had two people who spent an awful lot of time together. And I think it made a huge difference for how they managed to negotiate that. So that is one aspect. The other one is something that you mentioned the other day and which I think you will all recognize, and that is the notion of recognition. Usually when we talk international politics, we think in terms of recognition as states recognizing the other entity as being, if you will, sovereign and worthy of negotiating with. So there's that kind of formalistic level. But there is also the recognition of the people who are actually having to sit there to negotiate with each other and recognizing why the other person is holding the positions that they do. So this is what I would call the anthropological moment, where you start to see the rationale of the other side. So I'm just curious about whether you see this in the work that you have done, and if so, in what sense?
Well, we had a discussion about this prior, and I can tell you very clearly that when the parties spend so much time negotiating and talking to each other, you end up with the delegations becoming a little bit flipped where you have the delegation of one side basically going back home and representing the other side, even unconsciously, in the talks, because they understand exactly where they come from now after having all the discussion, even in the most difficult situations. You always find them a little bit closer to the position of the other side. And this is why sometimes you might have delegations being changed, and one side deciding we are going to change our team because that team has become so accustomed to the narrative from the other side that it becomes kind of part of the general wisdom. So on that front, it's very important. And that's actually the power of the human relation within the mediation itself. And this is why we were always insisting on a physical presence, like the political office for the Taliban, the political office for Hamas. This makes a whole lot of difference in the negotiation process itself. If you talk today to the leaders in the Taliban who were in Doha, they have a different outlook than those who've never left Afghanistan, obviously. If you talk today to the people in the political office, they have a different outlook. In Hamas, they have a different outlook than those who are within historical Palestine. So we need to increase that. The human relationship, the human connection needs to be increased. But on the other side of it, that needs to transcend to, as you started saying, to the other layers of peace facilitation. Because having two teams of bureaucrats meeting doesn't create peace in the future, even if they sign whatever document. It is the ability of people to people, wider relations between governments, and a chance for people to not only to understand each other's positions, but to rehumanize the other side. Because conflict is based in dehumanizing the other side. Right? In any conflict you you look at around the world, the other side, one way or the other, becomes subhuman, becomes evil. There is a need for that. War creates that. If you look at all the ads of World War II, now you look at it and it's quite funny. It's like cartoons, right? But at the time, it was very realistic to paint a Japanese person like a monster on an ad in the United States. And it was accepted because that was war. Then you have to rehumanize the Japanese person in the American psyche post the war. And this is why at many intervals beyond war, you end up with incidents of racial hatred that are based on this dehumanization that happened within the conflict. To rehumanize the other, you need engagement. To rehumanize the other, you need decision makers who are willing to make the difficult decision, the not so popular decisions, of engaging and allowing people-to-people relation, allowing the multi-layered peace facilitation, which sadly usually doesn't happen.
Yes, I mean the resilient peace, so to speak, is more than just signing a piece of paper. Charlotta.
Thank you. Well, I'll come back maybe to this humanizing aspect, which I think is absolutely key. But first, on one of the points that you made, Rusbe, on the time aspect, I think one needs to remember that many of these processes take an enormous amount of time, and much of that time is never seen, either because there are failures along the way, and or that the process is just going on without necessarily having an interest from outside. And I think that is important to remember, that enormous amount of time that is put in. But connected to that, I think, is the broader role of diplomacy. And I have always felt, in whatever position I have been, that as important as it has been for me to try to represent my country and to convey what is important in our policy and why it is important, as important it has been to also try to understand where people in the country where I've served are, or in Brussels when I served there, where other member states are, so that you also can inform your own hierarchies of those different positions. And I think that that element of the diplomat being, in a way, the go-between in trying to be the communicator in both directions. Coming back to the human aspect, so over the last few years, I've mainly been working with dialogues in different settings, so not so much with direct mediation, but rather with dialogues and track 2 diplomacy. And
maybe we should explain what track 2 is.
Yes, so an informal setting where sometimes official can also take part, but also a broader participation. It could be of academics, it could be of civil society, but with an aim of contributing to processes and come up with new creative ideas. And in those processes, I think a key element is an so to say informal, formal setting to create the possibility to get to know one another. And the last couple of days, we were having a session at the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, the CIPR Forum, on storytelling and how storytelling can be a useful tool in contributing to increasing the understanding. So we had a leading journalist, we had a leading civil society person working on environment, we had someone coming from the cultural sphere, we had someone coming from a think tank, and then we had numerous people coming in and talking precisely about that human story that actually make us understand that we're not talking about numbers, but we're talking about other human beings who could be us.
Two comments. One is, first, and I agree very much with what you were saying, Dr. Manzi, about the need to prepare the ground in the sense of anchoring what the delegation or what the mediator or what the diplomat is doing. And this is a very tricky matter because you can easily find yourself, having gone far out on the limb and not suddenly realizing that back home they are not following what you're doing and they may even have different views. So that is a very tricky and very important part of the whatever, be negotiation or peace mediation, to have your the decision making at political level being following what is happening and agreeing to what you're doing. Although one has occasionally to take some personal risks in the sense of you have to stick out your neck sometimes and try to find out a solution which you can then sell back home. But that is finding the mechanisms for that is important. Either sometimes one can agree to have some member of parliaments participating in the delegations. You can also have extensive briefings when at home while the process is going on, so that people feel that they are involved and they are included and they have their say. Otherwise, it can actually be quite turbulent periods later on. That's the first comment. The other one is one has to think about the aftermath after the mediation, what the prospects of, let's call it for finding a better term, to prepare the peace. There is always huge question marks as to how will the future look like. And we have seen that at length in some of the recent conflicts, some Iraq, Afghanistan, where peace wasn't quite well prepared. And I think that is extremely important to have this, the legitimacy and the visibility of the peace prospects and what is coming. And very often it depends on, there's a very clear economic dimension. One has to make clear that prospects, welfare, and so forth will be present as an aftermath, because that's a very strong incentive, usually.
I mean, just to kind of go back to where we started, when you were saying these things, it reminded me of when one reads of Talleyrand, when he's the maverick foreign minister of Napoleon. Napoleon doesn't even know what this guy is up to, but he's going around negotiating on behalf of France on things that go sometimes diametrically opposite to what Napoleon wants. And sometimes he gets away with it because he knows better than Napoleon what they should do. But also in more modern times, wasn't Richard Holbrooke partly that kind of maverick diplomat who wasn't always following what State Department or the White House wanted when it came to Bosnia or Afghanistan for that matter? But even with the modern communications at his time, he could sometimes at least get away with being maybe far ahead or far in some other direction than his government wanted him to be. But I wanted to because we've been talking about time and we've been talking about the relational aspect, to humanize not just the people you are negotiating with as a collective, faceless in the background, but the people that you're actually negotiating with literally. And it seems to me that often when people from the outside, for political reasons, feel the need to mediate, not themselves, but they want an issue solved, they tend to think that mediation is like parachuting someone in, talks to the parties, gets them to get along sufficiently so it's at least not a war, and then they can go home. And it seems to me, from what I hear from you and from what I've read, that that very, very seldom works, even when the parachuting is done by a superpower who could pressure everyone, that it simply is not enough. So since none of you represent the superpower, perhaps you could tell us a bit about how you go about creating not just the impression, but actually the commitment to continue the process beyond the mediation itself.
Well, let me start here with a disclaimer, which is, as the ambassador rightly mentioned, unless the parties are willing to reach an agreement, no agreement can be reached, and regardless of how much pressure you can put on the table. Right? Unless there is a belief by both parties that there needs to be an end to this conflict, then don't expect any mediator to succeed in any respect. However, I think the job of the mediator is to nudge both parties towards an agreement and towards a commitment to peace. Obviously, any conflict on the ground right now, you won't find both sides agreeing before they sit on the mediation table. That wouldn't work, unless one side is completely defeated, right? And therefore, there are three things that are needed, and I think if you put them together, they can form the model, at least that we follow in mediation. One is you need long-term engagement, strategic engagement. A relationship that is, as you said, parachuted into the scene doesn't work. Unless you have a strategic and long-term engagement with one of the parties, both of the parties, that actually establishes trust, then don't expect your mediation role to be easy from the start. Or at least you need to build that throughout the process and to be patient for it to be established. Two is you need a level of engagement and active mediation that allows for the parties to feel pressured by your mediation to talk and to find solutions. Right? You need to be able to invest in the process itself. You need to be able to build consensus outside of within the international community and in the outside world. You need to be able to sometimes even commit financially to the process itself and to be there on the table making up ideas and coming up with solutions rather than just transmitting ideas between both sides. And third, you need to be distant enough and close enough. You can't be a successful mediator if your country's national interest converges or diverges very clearly with one of the parties or the situation itself. You need to have enough distance between you and the case in order to be able to mediate between both sides. But you need to be close enough, in the sense that you need to be involved, invested, and for the parties to know that you are serious and honest and that you have an interest in the mediation succeeding. If you are too distant, we were having discussions in the last couple of days, if you want to be so impartial to the point where you don't have any opinion on anything that has to do with the mediation process itself, you will not be able to push the parties together. You need to have enough knowledge, understanding, but also involvement and engagement within the case itself in order to be pushing both sides forward. And I'll give just two anecdotal evidence. When we started negotiating for a deal between the separatists in Darfur and Sudan, the government of Sudan, we had to start working on development and aid in Darfur. And we started, our aid and development started before the agreement, to build that understanding of what's happening on the ground, to understand the human story behind it, and to be seen as part of the solution by the people in Darfur, by the people of Sudan, and by the parties. And that is what helped us continue, and what actually provided us now with a chance during this conflict, that the last place where the escalations reached was Darfur, although it should have been the first place where the escalation happened, because there was a social capital that was built through the process which we initiated. And the second example, of course, is Gaza. Now, you look at our work in Gaza before, which we are being attacked because of right now. The Reconstruction Committee, the Qatar Reconstruction Committee in Gaza, has worked all through the years since 2006 on reconstruction, on providing aid, providing health services, everything that we can do within Gaza to provide hope. That trust that was built with the people of Gaza has allowed us to maintain our role as mediator and to be trusted to do it. So unless you have that level, don't expect the parties to believe whatever you are saying and doing on the table, unless you have that kind of real human connection with the case itself.
Frank?
Well, I think I would like to highlight also the importance of the, let's call it, the other actors, be they neighbors or be they some of the great powers or regional powers with interests. They can be awfully destructive in any process, but they can also be extremely helpful, depending on how you are actually harnessing their energy into the process. And that is a dimension which is sometimes overlooked, but it can be, if you, in a systematic, and if the stars are well aligned, can be extremely helpful. And this we have seen in a number of the conflicts in the last decades, when the other actors, not anyone to be named in particular, actually works with or works against what you as a mediator are trying to achieve.
But would you say, and I mean, feel free to chip in some of these processes that we have seen, what at least I identify as the major basic flaw is that the people around the table are the ones who get along. And some of the ones who they don't get along with aren't at the table, which would, inevitably incentivize them to sabotage the process because they have nothing else. They have the power of no, and that is all they have. On the other hand, sometimes at least, it's very difficult to have everyone around the table to actually achieve something. Too many chefs, as we say in Sweden. What is your experience, Charlotta, Frank?
Well, I think the importance is to, at a very early stage, find out who they are and what stakes they have, and in what way can you sound out and see to what extent they could be constructive partners, although they're not at the table, but they could anyway. Governments, like people, have a sense of prestige as well. And if you are doing it in the right way, they could be quite constructive.
States are also like children. They
Yes.
have egos.
Yes.
Majed?
Well, to continue off what the ambassador was saying, the main issue there is how to identify who to include and who to exclude. Because you need to include the parties of the conflict, obviously. You need to include the saboteurs, because if you don't include the saboteurs, they will sabotage. And you need to include the constructive partners. And you need to identify those who are not party to the conflict, but can be party to the future conflict. Meaning, sometimes in many of the conflicts you see right now, there are parties that are hidden by the sheer size of the conflict. Conflicts that are under the table, waiting to explode as soon as you sign a peace agreement. Right? Whenever there is no external enemy, you might have internal enemies, internal adversaries starting to fight. So you need to identify all of these. And we tried to do that. Sadly, the situation did not work in Afghanistan. After we mediated between the Taliban and the United States, the plan was for the Afghan talks to start, where we went around and we collected all possible factions, demography, tribal allegiance, NGOs, every possible grouping you can find, and try to identify who would be suitable to put in a room to be within the Afghan talks, within the Loya Jirga that was supposed to be in Afghanistan, or in the talks in Doha. Now, sadly, the government collapsed very quickly after that, so we couldn't start it. But it's that kind of process that allows you to bring the people together. And I think it's very dangerous to go with a kitchen sink approach. You know, just everybody in the room and hope everything works well. You need to choose, first of all, you need to phase in the process. So you need a phase where very limited people are in the room, and then you expand from that. And then you need to exclude those who have absolutely no interest in peace and to isolate them in order to build a consensus around peace that would shame a certain party into accepting the solution. And I think in situations where the mediation is not between state and state, but between state and non-state actors, it's very important to understand what's happening there in that regard. Because you would have other non-state actors there, assuming that if this non-state actor signed the peace agreement tomorrow, they need to break it down. So they need to be isolated and they need to be put under enough pressure not to be part of the problem in the future.
Yeah, no, a couple of points building on what has been said. I think Dr. Majed's point on the long-term commitment is really, really important. And there, I mean, trust takes a long time to build for the mediator or the mediator's team. And I think that there we have maybe sometimes as diplomats a bit of a challenge. We have a rotation system. We stay on a post for a certain period of time and then we move on. We have elections, priorities are changing and so on. So that I think is something that we need to be mindful of. Another element is the complementary work that is needed. So the mediation and sometimes several mediation efforts that are going on in parallel and maybe by different mediators in different countries, but how they can become complementary and how one can find synergies where different actors can complement and add to each other, but also the risk, of course, that there is a double game that is going on. I think very important to look at different other actors, the neighbors, but it could be, as you say, other spoilers. But in the further process, going beyond the ending of a conflict or finding a solution of the immediate crisis, in the longer building of the peace, I think it's also important to see how can the ground in parallel to the mediation be laid for other actors. And that is, again, where I think that other kinds of dialogues are equally important and should be seen as complementary tools in building that confidence among other groups. And here I maybe want to highlight in particular, and you did in one of your speeches the other day, in a region like the Middle East, North Africa, where a significant part of the population is young population, and yet young people are often not present in the political life, not present or find it difficult to enter into the economic life. The unemployment is very high in many countries, the social exclusion. And this is the future of the region. It's the future of the world. So how do we make sure that we actually engage, include, and do that in a responsible way, and not only with token young people who are invited, but actually in an intergenerational dialogue where young people can be part of accompanying this process. And there I want to make a little bit of an advertisement of some work that the Swedish Dialogue Institute has been doing in the last year, where we have produced together with the Folke Bernadotte Academy a guidance note on intergenerational dialogue with some recommendations and tools of how to do this. But I think that this is something that is absolutely key, not necessarily, as you say, at the actual mediation, but in all this work that needs to be done in parallel.
And I just want to build on that a bit, because I think, I mean, what we are talking about is how to manage conflagrations. So, you know, it's like a volcano that erupts, and we're trying to deal with the eruption. But of course, there are tectonic plates that create the volcano to begin with. And I think one of the things that at least I have observed from having worked on this region not nearly as long as you have, is that a lot of the national narratives that you find in these countries are, and I mean, national narratives are often by definition partly exclusionary, because you're trying to define yourself and you're doing it in opposition one way or another to others that you have to delineate yourself from. But of course, when you've had the conflict, or when you're in a conflict, you take those narratives and make them even more exclusionary. And that means that if you want to solve the conflict long term, you don't need just social stability, you don't need to just kind of cap the volcano, you need to also change those narratives, because the next generation needs to not repeat what the previous generation, the misdeeds of the previous generation. So I mean, that's another aspect of the storytelling. I mean, what kind of stories do we tell about ourselves, and how much are they built on demonizing someone else for us to be able to say what we say about ourselves? We are now moving into the Q&A in a moment. Any final remarks before we open up the floor? Good. So, and as the New Yorker comic strip says, please remember, questions, not long speeches camouflaged as questions. Raise your hand, someone will bring you a microphone and you can ask your question. We will take 2 or 3 at a time, and if there is a particular person on the panel you want to ask the question to, please identify that person. It's a bit difficult with the light. I see 2 hands raised there, and then there. Ah, thank you. And then we'll pick up more as we go along.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's a great talk. Hussein Al-Faili, student here. So my question is about mediation in a multipolar world. Now we have diplomats who've experienced bipolar and a unipolar, and now we're moving to a multipolar world. What is the challenges, and what are you hopeful for? Thank you.
We'll take the next question there as well, once.
Yes, Yusuf Al-Mullah from the Danish Energy Agency, and I would like to thank the panelists for the interesting insights they gave. I would like to maybe ask one question starting of the discussion that we had, or the ambassador mentioned. Looking back at the previous peace deals that have been signed, is there lessons learned that there is some inherent sources of failure that have been in these peace deals that we need to pay attention in future deals? And the last thing, how we can rebuild the trust in the international community that have been shaken to a great extent in the recent conflicts. Thank you.
Very good. 2 very good questions. First of all, multipolarity, and of course, at least what I would insist on, the difference between the rules-based order and international law, which are not necessarily the same thing, at least depending on who you ask. And the fact that multipolarity means that we get different experiences on how people have experienced this rules-based order. And then, of course, lessons learned from previous peace deals in terms of what not to do. Frank, would you like to start?
Well, on the mediation in a multipolar world, I think this is an excellent trailer for multilateral diplomacy. We have such organs, and we don't always make good use of them, but we should, because this is the answer. Therefore, I think the Security Council of the United Nations, a reform of the Security Council, will eventually be called for, because that's the way to address the issue and the question you were raising. Not all conflicts, mind you, are facilitated by too much of a multilateral approach, but some are definitely. The other, concerning the second question, lessons learned from other peace deals is, was peace prepared, or did the mediation actually focus mainly on a kind of a ceasefire or ending the conflict, but not preparing the peace? And this brings up to Dr. Majid's question also, is there a hidden conflict which will erupt later on because we neglected the preparation for the peace?
Thank you. Charlotta.
Yes, well, first I totally agree with the points made by Ambassador Belfrage, but I want to maybe add, I think that in the complexity of the world that we are living in, it's more important than ever that we actually try to understand each other and understand where we come from. And maybe say beyond the politics, and I think that a cultural understanding is something that I would like to add in this dimension. And I served for a while as the director of the Swedish Diplomatic Academy or program. And during that period, when I was asked, what do you advise to us to do before we go out to a posting, I always said, don't only read the history and the politics about the country, but read the novels from the country. Try to understand the cultural dimension. So I think that has always been important, but I think it's maybe even more important today. And it connects to the question of the humanization. On the past failures, well, first of all, I want to mention that very recently there was a book published by Uppsala University and some others on mediation in the Arab world. And it goes through several of the mediation initiatives in the Arab world and looks into the failures. In general, I think that we need to look much more, not only learning from history, but actually embracing failures. In the entrepreneurial world, I think that is really key. I've had long discussions with your daughter on this, where it is actually maybe something that we all should look at entrepreneurs and see that they have become successful because they failed and then learned from their failures and built up something new. And I think that is maybe we should look at more in politics as well.
I can just add that my favorite historian, since I'm an historian, once said that only the people who lose in history learn from history. Everyone else think they got it right from the beginning, which very seldom is true. Please.
Thank you. First of all, regarding multipolarity, I have a very cynical view of the prospect of moving towards multipolarity. First of all, I question the notion itself. Are we really moving towards a multipolar world in the sense that there are poles that are competing over hegemony? Or are we moving towards chaos, where you have a weakened pole and an even more weakened regional poles than others who are trying to utilize the gaps created by a weakened pole? And then you end up with an unpoliced international system, and where opportunists, entrepreneurs within the international community, would basically take advantage within certain regions. And that I think, I mean, it's an intellectual discussion over, and it's not the question, but I think it's important to always reassess ourselves, because we're taking it for granted now that we are moving towards a multipolar world. But again, I think we need to question that and understand it the right way. Diversity in mediation is usually good. And I'll try to be as careful as possible in making such a grand, because at many times through the past decades, the fact that a certain club was the only one that can do peace facilitation and mediation, and it was seen that only countries who are liberal democracies can go on and play the role of mediator, created a lot of lost moments because of things like moral superiority, because of perceptions of these countries, because of the inability of these countries to transcend cultural divides, and so on. Today, with the diversity of mediators that we have, even when you have mediations that might seem unsettling in the beginning, like, for example, China's role with Iran and Saudi Arabia, they create new avenues for peace that otherwise would not be available. So I think, generally speaking, a diversity of mediation is a good thing. It would provide you, unless, of course, it turns out to be a competition over mediation that is not healthy, and then we get into another situation. Regarding stories of failure or lessons about failure in mediation, one cautionary tale there is every mediation is its own animal. If you think that you have, like, you can write the book on mediation, and you can go with a clear playbook on what to do, then I think you'll fail very quickly. Because every setting is different, every setting is unique. Yes, of course, there are common things to do, but I think it's very important for us to take every mediation, every peace facilitation effort, case by case, understand the context, and make sure that we don't fall in the trap of patterns. Because it's like trying to follow a roadmap in another country. So if I take Google Maps map to take me from here to my hotel, And while I go to Norway next year, try to use the same map, probably I'll hit a wall midway through the trip. And this is exactly what might happen if you're trying to follow the same playbook for everything. Trust in the international community. I find it very difficult to be optimistic about trust in the international community, or to even sound like a diplomat and say that, you know, we have to rebuild trust in the international community and the international system, for that matter. I think we failed at every turn in re-legitimizing the international community in the eyes of the peoples of the world. We have failed in Syria, we have failed in Russia, Ukraine, we have failed today in Gaza, and every time it makes it clearer and clearer that the international system is being used and abused by those who have the power to use it and abuse it. Unless that reality changes, and I don't think it's likely to change anytime soon, especially with the heightened polarization around the world, how are we going to convince our own peoples that the international system is able to create peace and to maintain peace around the world? The conflicts that are taking place today, a lot of them have been put on the table of the international system. And between vetoes and inability and inefficacy, the international community ends up creating a farce. We need at least one success story that we can build upon. There were success stories in the past that sadly, even today, they are jeopardized, like Bosnia, for example, where the international community could jump in and could create a new situation. But we are seeing what's happening over there now. So we need new success stories, enable for somebody like me to be able, in good conscience, to come and say, we should believe in the international system. But right now, I think we are facing the bleakest moment since World War II in believing that the international system could actually function.
And here I thought I was the grumpy cat. But let me pick up on this challenge of multipolarity for a moment. I mean, historically, multipolarity was the normal. I mean, since the 20th century, with its unipolar moment and its bipolar moment, is the unique exception. Partly also because it's a more global world with interaction across the globe is normal, while 300 years ago you would have stuck to your own continent, so to speak. But at the same time, wouldn't you say that the very fact that countries like Qatar today and others who are non-Western countries can do mediation and be successful is partly because the space has opened up for that, and that diversity is an expression of the multipolar world, not in the sense of seeking hegemony, because that's I think it's a futile quest for anyone to take that on, but in the fact that you have more regional levels and more actors who can come and do and find a niche on the global stage, as it were, where they do their thing without it being an expression of an ambition towards any kind of hegemony.
Well, I'm reminded of the contradictory positions over US influence in the Middle East. While in the same breath, you can hear somebody saying the US should stay out of the Middle East, but the US should solve the problems of the Middle East, right? And this is the problem we are facing right now, which is the lack of a structure within the international community, in my opinion, is more dangerous than a structure that gives power to certain poles. And while opportunism could go both ways in filling the gap that is created by the withdrawal and the great power rivalry, that opportunism is seldom positive. Because at the end, states will seek to advance their own national interests. They will be looking inwards, and you'll have less cooperation and more competition. But what I was referring to was, as you said, if we go back to the norm, in the norm, there were clear power structures based on hard power, where bigger states would eat smaller states and would have influence over so on and so on. I think we're moving to a point where in many regions around the world, the map is not, first of all, there's a failure of the central state in places like Africa, like the Middle East. And second of all, the definition of power has been, it's totally different now, right? It's not the number of soldiers you have. It's not the geography you have. It's not the resources you have. It could be your political savviness. It could be your presence on social media. It could be a vote you have in a regional or international organization. And you look now at actors that should not be powerful, who are, and can affect positive or negative change in a way that is hopeful, in a sense, where smaller powers that usually were dominated by their regional competitors are now able to exercise more rights. But it also means that one disruptor that doesn't have the traditional definition of a powerful actor can disrupt a whole region just by using the gap of not there being structure within the international system. So while I agree totally that at the end it's a uniqueness of this century or the past century that we see one or two poles controlling the world, I question how the road back to a sense of normalcy in multipolarity will look like.
On that, we agree. And I think to some degree, for many reasons, both domestically and foreign policy, we are in a period that reminds me of the time between the two world wars. And many of the structures that we had in the bipolar moment after the war was based on having had the experience of the war. So we can at least hope that we can reach a new stability without having to go through that kind of immense conflict. Questions? There and then there. Here.
Thank you. My name is Omar Sheikh Mus. I'm an independent analyst. Professor Peter Wallenstein of Uppsala University Peace Institute relates an episode in the Oslo process. He mentions that the Norwegian mediators, I'm referring here to what Dr. Majed said about the willingness of the party is extremely necessary to reach an agreement, and you cannot force them to get to an agreement. He relates that the Norwegian mediators noticed something very positive, that the Israeli and the Palestinian delegations started talking to each other outside the meetings and were looking for the coffee pauses and the lunch pauses in order to be able to talk to each other without our intervention. But if you look at the situation now and with your mediation in the Gaza conflict now, there is a lot of arm twisting by all the actors that are hoping to reach an agreement so that there will be a possible peace or at least a ceasefire and some sort of agreement. What chances do you see for this process to succeed if we are doing it with forcing them into an agreement rather than a willingness that exists there? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a there, yes.
Good evening. My name is Ole Spongberg. I'm a former student here, and I just realized that my question is slightly similar. So I am addressing Charlotta Sparre directly now. You mentioned imposed solution and that they are in many cases not very successful. So could you please elaborate on that and perhaps give a couple of examples of, I get the impression that you are advocating some sort of bottom-up approach, one might say. Thank you.
Very good. Please.
Well, I think I'm sounding more and more pessimistic as we go on in this. Obviously, the conditions before the 7th of October were not ripe for any kind of peace process to start. Were not ripe for any kind of mediation to succeed. Post the 7th of October, with the trauma in Israel and the results of the current war in Gaza, it is near impossible to have anybody within each system advocating for peace. The only way forward was, and this is what we were doing in the beginning, is to choose one issue where need would push both sides to agree on. And this was the hostage issue, where we knew that the political system would drive this political actor to go towards the negotiation table, and the opportunity on the other side would drive this side to go to the negotiation table. And this is why I think the focus mainly was on the hostage issue and creating a pause And within the pause itself, then you go to the bigger negotiation. And this is the current proposal, 3 phases. First phase is 40 days. The Israelis get their hostages back, the civilians and the IDF women. And that allows, first of all, cooling of heads in Israel. And then it would also allow them to accept the idea of sitting down and talking about ceasefire. Right. On the other side, the fact that they are losing their leverage every day that goes by means that they need that moment. And also, again, you will get a chance where the war stops, they can collect their dead, they can bury them, they can move their people to more safer location, and that would allow them to be invested in the process itself. So it's not a matter of coercing the parties, but providing the opportunities, building the need, designing the situation where both sides, kicking and screaming, will come to the negotiation table because they have something to get out of it. However, now that said, it has been one of the most difficult mediations in recent history. Because basically, you're not mediating between 2 parties, you're mediating between the whole world. Right? And you are fighting against electoral cycles in Europe and the United States, you are fighting against political actors, local political actors in countries all around the world, you're fighting against the fact that the trauma that was created by the situation, and you're fighting against the field itself and what is happening every day in this war. And therefore, it would be very delusional of me to say that I'm optimistic about creating peace in the situation. I think what we can hope for right now is freezing the conflict and then finding ways of moving from this moment to a moment where we can find partners for peace on both sides.
This reminds me very much of the Kissinger approach. Kissinger was a very strong advocate for the step-by-step solution, where you are confidence building and you prepare for the next step, and also building in the prospects of what the end result could look like in terms of economic advantages, of welfare increases, and so forth. So I think this is, if we ever, or if the international community ever succeeds, I share to some extent your pessimism, but it would be such a stepwise and incremental approach would probably be the way towards finding this solution. I remember having a long talk with I was posted in France with the then Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine, who always said the Middle East is such a frustrating exercise in the sense that you know the solution. We have known it since Resolution 262 back in 1967. We have had the Arab Peace Initiative. We have had so many of these. They all speak about the same. It's land for peace. We know that. But it will take thousands and thousands of people who will lose their lives, material disasters of a monumental scale, before we will end up probably with that solution, because we've known it. We've known it since 1967.
There's a lot of things that are frustrating with the present
situation.
But I think in particular, it is the fact that we already have gamed out an iteration for every potential solution. So it's not rocket science in that way. It's more whether anyone is willing to invest in the political process of getting there. And that's where it seems to be rather thin in terms of actors within the 2 camps.
I mean, the main problem here is you can't have any expectation of Land for Peace succeeding unless something major changes in both camps. If you look at the demography in Israel right now, demography is telling you that in electoral cycles in the future, you will have even more radicalizations, right? Regardless of what the international community hopes for. If you look at the situation in Palestine, around 60-70% of the fighters of Hamas are orphans. How many orphans do you have right now as a result of this war, with 34,000 people killed? Right? So the future looks very bleak in creating the chances for peace. But the only thing that we can hope for is that we know from history, and you're a historian, you know this better than I, that from the wounds of conflict, that most terrible conflict around the world, is when the world decides to sit down and talk about peace. And sadly, we are facing a humanitarian catastrophe right now that has opened the eyes of the whole world towards the Palestinian issue. If you go back a couple of months ago, well, 8 months ago, the Palestinian issue was not in the priority list of the international community, not in the UN and the multilateral format, or even in the regional format in the Middle East. And today, we all have to sit here and talk about it because it's priority number one because of the humanitarian crisis and the human cost of this war. So we hope that that would bring the issue back to the table, and while all the solutions are already known, at least change the narrative on the ground enough to make the international community feel that it needs to solve this, or end up in the same place a couple of months down the line.
I think Dr. Majed and Ambassador Frank made it somewhat easier for me to respond to the question and also give me a chance to maybe clarify. I do not mean that one should have softer approaches as an alternative to mediation. I think that there are no alternatives when it comes to coming to a ceasefire or to working for freezing a conflict. But to build the peace and to look for more long-term solutions, I think it will not only be enough with sitting at the formal negotiation tables. I think there will have to be a lot of other activities that and other parties who need to be involved, as has been stated again and again, to build that step-by-step approach that you both spoke about and that I also totally subscribe to. So, yes, it can be very effective temporarily with some arm twisting, with some carrots, with some sticks, but to actually go from there to build something that is long-term sustainable, one will need to address the root causes, and that usually is so complex that it will have to be in a multiple process of different actors and different methods.
Good. We have reached 7:30. Any final words from anyone? Well, then I would, yeah.
Yes, no, I just want to thank my fellow panelists and you, Rusbe. I think it's been such a rich discussion, and at least I have learned a lot.
Thank you very much. Let's give the panelists. Thank you very much for participating in tonight's discussion. 21st of May, Israel and Gaza. Thank you.